Hi, and welcome back to U.S. History with Mr. Snyder. That's me, and today we're going to talk about Topic 5, Lesson 3, the end of World War I. We'll talk about the contributions of the Americans to the Allied victory in World War I, talk about Wilson's 14 points, analyze the decisions made at the Paris Peace Conference, including in the Treaty of Versailles, and why the U.S. Senate does not ratify the Treaty of Versailles. Spoiler alert. But America enters the war, and once we do, we start an old military tactic called convoys. And convoys protect merchant shipping. Merchant ships sail together in groups and are protected by warships along the outside. This way, the German U-boats could not fire through the warships to sink any more ships. Something else that happens is in 1917, Vladimir Lenin starts a revolution in Russia in order for Russia to become communist. And so Russia has to pull out of the war to fight their own civil war. So in 1918, a treaty ends the war on the Eastern Front. And in 1918, that's when American troops arrive in large numbers in France. And they're called the American Expeditionary Force, or the AEF. And American forces are led by General John J. Pershing. You might remember him from, he's the guy who was chasing Pancho Villa all over the Mexican desert. So it's about this time that because of the blockade and just attrition, that Germans begin running out of troops and supplies. 1.5 million total Americans fight in World War I, and 50,000 die in the war. Finally, later that year, on November 11th, 1918, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, Germany surrenders. And people lay down their arms, and we commemorate Armistice Day. And today it is known as Veterans Day for all veterans of all wars. 5 million Allied troops, 8 million Central troops, and 6.5 million civilians are all dead from this great war. So now we have to begin picking up the pieces. And Wilson decides this is too important to leave to some bureaucrat, so I'm going to go to Europe myself. And he goes to the Paris Peace Conference in Europe himself and promotes peace without victory. His idea of peace without victory just means that there's no loser in the war. We just need to be glad it's over and try to move on. And Wilson initially promotes his 14 points to Congress. And so these 14 points are America's aims in the post-World War. Ideas in these 14 points include freedom of the seas, free trade, the end of colonialism, the reduction of arms in countries, or weapons. Self-determination is an important one, which is allowing countries to choose their own government. And the last thing that he wants is a League of Nations, or an organization where people can send representatives to work out problems diplomatically. We now have that today. It's called the United Nations, but back then this is kind of like a pre-UN, and it won't work eventually for some reasons we'll talk about. Wilson's biggest opponent is Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, and he's a Republican foreign policy expert. He wants to put U.S. interests in the world first and gain more power in world affairs. So going over and allowing self-determination and freedom of the seas and to end colonialism and imperialism, this is not what he is all about. So Wilson is not without his detractors in going to the Paris Peace Conference. Here's another look at Wilson's 14 points, specifically what they are, but we pretty much just summarized them. You can see number 14 there is the League of Nations. So at the Paris Peace Conference is held by the Allies in Versailles, France, which is just outside of Paris, to write the Treaty of Versailles. David Lloyd George and Clemenceau do not share Wilson's idealism. Lloyd George is the British Prime Minister, and French Premier Clemenceau do not share Wilson's idealism. They suffer greater losses than the U.S. They want to punish Germany for starting this war so that they don't do it again, wink, wink. They do not add all of Wilson's 14 points, and they end up on the scrap heap, and they're not going to put them in the Treaty of Versailles. But Wilson insists that they do begin a League of Nations, so that's what they do. They want to make Germany suffer, so they actually have them pay reparations or payments for the damages of the war. Here's how much damage you did. You need to start paying us off. And actually, they just started paying off stuff. They just finished paying off reparations a couple of years ago from World War I. This is supposed to weaken them so they could never threaten Europe again. Problems with this peace treaty are the new countries that they draw are not allowed self-determination, and believe it or not, that we now have multiple ethnicities living together in the same country, and that causes problems. Germans are now living in non-German states. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire is broken up, and new ethnicities are just thrown together haphazardly into these new states of Iraq, Syria, and Jordan. And these new states were not allowed to choose their own government. They're overseen as mandates by Britain and France. Adding to all the trouble, in 1918 and 1919, an influenza pandemic spreads all over the world, and people get sick with the flu. We're not as immune to the flu back then. It's not like there's a flu vaccine. So 50 million people die, and that includes 675,000 Americans. And then coming back here in our country, the U.S. Senate has to ratify any treaty that the president agrees to. It's a check on the president's power. So there's a couple different groups in the Senate looking at this Treaty of Versailles. So the irreconcilables are senators who don't think that the U.S. should be involved in world politics anymore. And Article 10 of the League of Nations Covenant would involve the United States in foreign wars because it pledges mutual defense. So if another country gets attacked, we have to come to their aid. And some would even say that's unconstitutional because Congress is the only people in the United States that can declare war. Reservationists have their reservations about the treaty. They oppose the treaty as it's written. They want changes made before it's ratified. This is Henry Cabot Lodge. Wilson suffers a stroke and is very, very sick during this time and dies shortly after. But he asks his Democratic senators to vote against the treaty if there are any changes to it. So they go through a couple of votes, one with a lot of changes, one with no changes, one with a few changes, and each time it is rejected. So America does not ratify the Treaty of Versailles, and America does not join the League of Nations, even though it was our idea to create the League of Nations. Now it's going to be ineffective because it doesn't really have the backing of the United States or any powerful nation to make sure that the decisions that they make in the League of Nations are abided by. So that's all I have for the end of World War I. We'll talk more about the post-World War and what that means and the 1920s next time. But for now, write down any questions that you may have, bring them back to class, and I will see you later. Have a good night. Bye-bye.